January 12th, 2014. In strip malls across America, employees locked the glass doors for the final time and quietly pulled down the iconic torn ticket signs. The blue and yellow glow that had illuminated Friday nights for a generation was permanently extinguished. Just a decade earlier, this exact scene would have been unimaginable. At its absolute peak in 2004, Blockbuster was an unstoppable cultural juggernaut. 9,000 stores dominated the globe. 60,000 employees manned the counters. $6 billion flowed through their registers annually. They didn't just rent VHS tapes and DVDs. They owned the American weekend. Families crowded the brightly lit aisles, hunting for new releases under the fluorescent lights. Today, those bustling aisles are gone. The familiar scent of plastic cases and carpet cleaner has been replaced by the sterile quiet of urgent care clinics, laundromats, and abandoned parking lots. An entire Friday night ritual, utterly erased. How does a monopoly that dictates the entertainment habits of an entire nation simply vanish? It wasn't just the arrival of red envelopes in the mail or the convenience of broadband streaming. It was a fatal cocktail of corporate arrogance, a business model addicted to punishing its own loyal customers, and a $50 million boardroom miscalculation that became the greatest missed opportunity in retail history. Dallas, Texas, 1985-2014. The rise and fall of the undisputed king of home video reveals exactly what happens when an empire builds its fortune on late fees, wages a bitter civil war within its own ranks, and ultimately hands the future of entertainment to the very rival it once laughed out of the room. The year is 1985. The VCR has rapidly transformed from an expensive luxury novelty item into an absolute household staple. For the first time in human history, average consumers did not have to wait for a network television broadcast or drive to a crowded theater to watch a movie. They could bring the magic of Hollywood directly into their living rooms. But the infrastructure to support this explosive new demand was woefully inadequate. The early video rental industry was a chaotic, fragmented Wild West, dominated almost entirely by independent mom-and-pop operators. If a family wanted to rent a movie on a Friday night in the early 80s, they likely had to navigate a cramped, dimly lit storefront. Inventory was often hidden behind a counter, forcing customers to thumb through dog-eared, laminated binders or read handwritten lists just to see what might be available. Copies of hit movies were agonizingly scarce, leading to constant frustration. Furthermore, to maintain profit margins, a significant portion of these early independent stores relied heavily on adult films, which were frequently sectioned off only by a curtain in the back room. This gave the entire rental experience a slightly seedy, uncomfortable atmosphere for suburban families. It was an industry begging for modernization, standard operating procedures, and above all, scale. Enter David Cook. Cook was not a Hollywood insider, a film buff, or a traditional retail visionary. He was a pragmatic Texan software engineer who had made his fortune building massive, complex databases for the oil and gas industry. When the Texas oil boom busted in the mid-1980s, Cook found himself looking for his next major venture. It was his wife, Sandy, an avid movie fan, who suggested looking into the booming, yet disorganized video rental market. Where others looked at the rental landscape and saw an entertainment business, David Cook looked at it and saw a logistics and data management problem. The mom-and-pop stores were failing to scale because they couldn't track their inventory efficiently. They relied on trust, paper ledgers, and guesswork. They didn't know what was making money, what was gathering dust on the shelf, or exactly who had kept a highly sought-after tape for 3 weeks. Cook realized that if he could apply his enterprise-level database expertise to the thousands of VHS tapes required to run a massive store, he could revolutionize the entire customer experience. He was not setting out to build a mere video store. He was building a highly sophisticated, data-driven distribution center disguised as a retail storefront. In October 1985, Cook opened the very first Blockbuster video store at the intersection of Skillman Street and Northwest Highway in Dallas, Texas. The contrast to the industry standard was immediate, deliberate, and completely staggering. Instead of a dark, cramped room, customers walked into a massive, brightly lit space that felt more like a modern, clean supermarket than a neighborhood video club. The shelves were completely open, allowing customers to hold the oversized plastic VHS cases in their hands. Instead of a measly few hundred tapes, this first blockbuster boasted an unheard-of inventory of 8,000 tapes, encompassing over 6,500 distinct titles. Cook achieved this logistical miracle by utilizing a revolutionary barcode system. Every single VHS tape and every single customer's laminated membership card was scanned by custom-built computer terminals at the checkout counter. This allowed the store to track every piece of inventory in real time, preventing theft and ensuring accurate billing. Crucially, Cook also made a hardline, family-friendly decision. No adult films, ever. The bright blue and yellow color scheme, the spacious aisles, and the wholesome, brightly lit atmosphere made it a safe, welcoming destination for parents and children alike. The Dallas store was an overnight sensation. Lines wrapped around the building on weekends. Behind the counter, the computer system hummed, tracking rentals, identifying high-demand titles instantly, and churning out precise data that allowed Cook to optimize his inventory with ruthless efficiency. Blockbuster was instantly profitable. Buoyed by this success, Cook quickly opened a few more locations and built a massive $6 million distribution center designed to support a nationwide franchise rollout. He had successfully rewritten the rules of retail, proving that technology, data, and sheer scale could tame the Wild West of home video. However, while David Cook had engineered the brilliant operational blueprint, the sheer volume of capital required to scale this vision nationally was beginning to stretch his resources. The tech company disguised as a video store had laid the perfect foundation, but to build a global empire, it would require a businessman with an insatiable appetite for aggressive, uncompromising expansion. By 1987, David Cook had definitively proven his concept. He had successfully built a highly efficient, data-driven video rental machine, but realizing the true potential of this machine, transforming it from a successful regional operation into an undisputed national monopoly, required a level of capital and aggressive corporate maneuvering that Cook simply did not possess. The tech pioneer had laid the foundation, but the empire required a conqueror. Enter H. Wayne Huizenga. Huizenga was already a titan of American business, a man who had previously built waste management into a Fortune 500 behemoth by relentlessly acquiring hundreds of independent garbage collection companies. Huizenga did not possess a shred of romanticism about the film industry. He was not a cinephile. Where consumers saw the magic of Hollywood, Huizenga saw a highly scalable business model generating massive, predictable cash flow. He recognized that Cook's barcode system and family-friendly atmosphere were the perfect vehicles for a nationwide rollout. In 1987, Huizenga and a group of investors bought a controlling interest in Blockbuster for $18 million. Almost immediately, the clash of visions between the pragmatic founder and the aggressive corporate raider became untenable. Cook favored a cautious, steady franchise model. Huizenga wanted explosive, overwhelming, corporate-owned dominance. Within months, Cook departed the company he had created, leaving Huizenga with absolute control to execute one of the most aggressive retail expansions in American history. Under Huizenga's command, Blockbuster did not just grow, it blitzkrieged the American suburbs. The strategy was brutally effective: build massive new stores on high-traffic corner lots and simultaneously buy out any existing regional chains that stood in their way. They acquired major competitors like Errol's Video and Major Video, slapping the iconic torn ticket logo over the old signs almost overnight. At the height of this expansion, Blockbuster was opening a new retail location every 17 hours. The brilliance of Huizenga's rollout lay in its uncompromising standardization. Whether a customer walked into a Blockbuster in Miami, Florida, or Seattle, Washington, the experience was identically engineered. The bright fluorescent lighting, the blue and yellow carpeting, the waist-high checkout counters, and the meticulously organized walls of new releases were entirely uniform. This predictability became a powerful psychological tool. In an era before the internet, moving to a new town could be disorienting, but the glowing blue and yellow sign of a Blockbuster promised a familiar, safe, and guaranteed form of weekend entertainment. Blockbuster fundamentally altered the rhythm of American domestic life, pioneering the concept of the blockbuster night. A trip to the video store was no longer a simple errand. It was elevated to an event, a Friday evening ritual for millions of families. Children would sprint toward the kids section, recognizable by its distinct layout, while parents debated over the new releases wall, a towering display of hundreds of copies of the latest Hollywood hits. The company cleverly placed massive displays of microwave popcorn, oversized boxes of theater candy, and Coca-Cola directly in the checkout lanes, successfully capturing highly profitable concession sales and cementing the idea that Blockbuster provided the entire movie theater experience in a single bag. By the early 1990s, the mom-and-pop video stores were being systematically wiped off the map. They simply could not compete with Blockbuster's vast inventory, bright aesthetics, and sheer marketing muscle. Blockbuster became a ubiquitous cultural touchstone, as recognizable as McDonald's or Coca-Cola. The phrase, "make it a blockbuster night," permeated the national consciousness. However, this total victory contained the seeds of a profound corporate arrogance. By annihilating the competition, Blockbuster removed any incentive to innovate. Their immense size meant they dictated terms to the Hollywood studios, not the other way around. Furthermore, to maintain their pristine, family-friendly image and mass appeal, they refused to stock adult films and largely ignored niche, independent, or foreign cinema, homogenizing the American viewing experience. They had built a flawless, unstoppable retail machine, but the very mechanics that made that machine so profitable were about to become the source of massive, widespread consumer resentment. The empire had captured the American weekend, but it was about to start punishing the very customers who built it. By the mid-1990s, Blockbuster was no longer just a dominant retail chain. It was an undeniable pillar of the global entertainment complex. The relentless expansion spearheaded by Wayne Huizenga had created an empire so vast and profitable that it caught the attention of the largest media conglomerates on Earth. In 1994, Viacom, the corporate behemoth controlled by billionaire Sumner Redstone, purchased Blockbuster for a staggering $8.4 billion. For Viacom, acquiring Blockbuster wasn't just about owning video stores. It was about controlling the primary distribution pipeline for Hollywood's output. At the time, home video was becoming significantly more lucrative than the theatrical box office itself. Blockbuster was the undisputed gatekeeper to the American living room, and Viacom wanted the keys. Under Viacom's massive corporate umbrella, Blockbuster reached its absolute zenith. By the late 90s and early 2000s, the blue and yellow torn ticket logo was practically omnipresent. The statistics from this peak era are almost difficult to comprehend in the modern digital age. Blockbuster operated over 9,000 stores worldwide. They employed over 60,000 people. At any given moment, millions of American households had a rented Blockbuster VHS tape or DVD sitting on their television stand. However, maintaining this level of dominance required solving the single greatest frustration of the video rental business: the out-of-stock problem. For years, the industry standard was a point of immense friction for consumers. When a highly anticipated blockbuster movie was released on video, a store might purchase 10 or 20 copies. Because studios priced these tapes for the rental market at exorbitantly high rates, often $65 to $80 per cassette, stores simply could not afford to buy enough copies to meet the massive weekend demand. Customers would rush to Blockbuster on a Friday evening, only to find empty plastic display boxes where the new releases should be. To solve this, Blockbuster leveraged its immense market power to fundamentally rewrite the economics of Hollywood distribution. In the late 1990s, the company pioneered a revolutionary revenue-sharing model with the major film studios. Instead of paying $65 up front for a single VHS tape, Blockbuster negotiated unprecedented agreements to purchase tapes for a mere fraction of the cost, often between $2 and $4 per unit. In exchange, Blockbuster agreed to hand over approximately 40% of the rental revenue generated by that specific tape back to the studio. This pivot was a masterstroke of retail logistics. Because the upfront cost of inventory plummeted, Blockbuster could suddenly afford to stock dozens, sometimes over 100 copies of a single hit movie. They launched aggressive marketing campaigns guaranteeing that new releases would be in stock or the next rental would be free. Customers walking into a store were greeted by an entire wall dedicated to the week's biggest movie, a visual spectacle of guaranteed entertainment. This revenue-sharing agreement solidified Blockbuster's monopoly, absolutely crushing any remaining independent rental stores that simply did not have the volume or the leverage to negotiate similar deals with Hollywood executives. The cash flow was biblical. Annual revenues soared toward the $6 billion mark. Wall Street analysts viewed the company as an indestructible cash machine. But hidden within those multi-billion-dollar balance sheets was a deeply flawed, incredibly dangerous revenue stream. It was a mechanism that generated enormous short-term profits, but at a devastating long-term cost to the brand's reputation. The empire had found a way to guarantee inventory, but it had also become secretly addicted to penalizing the very families walking through its doors. While the revenue-sharing model with Hollywood studios ensured that Blockbuster's shelves were always overflowing with the latest hits, it simultaneously created a dangerous structural dependency. To keep the massive corporate machine running, to pay for the thousands of leases, the 60,000 employees, and the billions in debt interest owed to Viacom, Blockbuster needed a constant, massive stream of liquid cash. They found that stream not in the rental price of the movies themselves, but in the punishment of their customers. By the late 1990s, late fees had evolved from a minor administrative deterrent into a primary pillar of Blockbuster's financial health. The policy was simple but ruthless. If a customer failed to return a movie by the exact time specified on their receipt, a penalty, often equal to the cost of a full new rental, was automatically triggered for every single day the item remained out. For the average American family, the Blockbuster late fee became a source of ubiquitous, low-level anxiety. It wasn't uncommon for a busy parent to forget a couple of DVDs in the back of a minivan for 3 days, only to walk into a store and be greeted by a teenage clerk informing them they owed $20 or $30 in penalties before they could rent again. Because the systems were digitized and linked to the customer's membership card, there was no room for negotiation. The computer was judge, jury, and executioner. Internally, Blockbuster's leadership became addicted to this revenue from resentment. In peak years, late fees accounted for as much as 16% of the company's total global revenue, generating roughly $800 million in pure, high-margin profit annually. On paper, it was a brilliant business move, getting paid twice for the same piece of inventory. But in the hearts of the consumers, it was a slow-acting poison. Blockbuster was no longer seen as the friendly neighbor providing entertainment. It was increasingly viewed as a predatory gatekeeper, waiting for its customers to slip up. This addiction to late fee revenue created a profound innovator's dilemma. Because the company relied so heavily on these penalties to meet its quarterly earnings targets, any attempt to make the rental process more convenient or flexible for the customer was viewed as a direct threat to the bottom line. Blockbuster wasn't just ignoring the future, it was financially incentivized to keep the most frustrating aspects of the past alive. The tension reached a boiling point in the late 90s, but the leadership remained insulated by their massive market share. They believed they were too big to be challenged. They assumed that because they owned the corner lot in every major suburb, the customer had no choice but to accept the penalties. They failed to realize that they weren't just collecting dollars. They were building a massive reservoir of ill will. Across the country, millions of customers were beginning to fantasize about a world where they wouldn't be punished for being a day late. One of those customers happened to be a Silicon Valley entrepreneur named Reed Hastings. Legend has it that Hastings was charged a $40 late fee for a copy of Apollo 13, and the sheer frustration of that experience inspired him to co-found a small, experimental startup called Netflix. Whether the Apollo 13 story is literal truth or corporate myth, the reality remains. Blockbuster's greatest profit center was also its greatest strategic vulnerability. The empire was thriving, but it had built its castle on the backs of angry subjects. And just as the late fee cash cow reached its maximum yield, the technology that would make the physical storefront and its dreaded penalties completely obsolete was beginning to emerge from the shadows. The year was 2000. As the new millennium dawned, the Blockbuster empire appeared completely unassailable. Under the leadership of CEO John Antioco, the company had successfully transitioned from the bulky VHS tape to the newer, sleeker DVD format, further cementing its iron grip on the home entertainment market. Wall Street absolutely adored Antioco. He was a seasoned retail veteran who knew exactly how to optimize physical store layouts, squeeze profit margins, and keep the billions of dollars flowing through the registers. Inside the gleaming, glass and steel blockbuster corporate headquarters at the Renaissance Tower in downtown Dallas, Texas, the atmosphere was one of supreme, untouchable confidence. They were not merely participating in the industry, they dictated its reality. But 2,000 miles away in the sleepy Silicon Valley suburb of Los Gatos, California, a radically different vision of the future was violently struggling to survive. A small, scrappy startup called Netflix was attempting to build a business model based entirely on the United States Postal Service and the relatively lightweight DVD format. Founded by Mark Randolph and Reed Hastings, Netflix allowed customers to order movies online and receive them directly in their mailboxes, completely bypassing the physical storefront. Furthermore, they were heavily experimenting with a flat-rate subscription model that eliminated the very thing Blockbuster relied on most heavily: late fees. Conceptually, it was brilliant. Financially, it was an absolute bloodbath. By the spring of 2000, the infamous dot-com bubble had begun to burst. Investment capital, which had previously flowed like water into any company with a .com attached to its name, suddenly dried up overnight. Netflix was burning through cash at an alarming, thoroughly unsustainable rate. They were on track to lose nearly $50 million that year alone. The exorbitant cost of acquiring new customers, purchasing massive DVD inventories, and paying for constant two-way postal shipping was crushing the young company. Randolph and Hastings looked at their rapidly dwindling bank accounts and realized a terrifying truth. If they didn't find a massive influx of cash or a corporate savior, Netflix would be completely bankrupt within months. They desperately needed a lifeline, and there was only one company on earth with the capital, the inventory, and the sheer industry leverage to save them. They needed Blockbuster. In September of 2000, Hastings and Randolph managed to secure a meeting with John Antioco and the Blockbuster executive team. The plan was audacious, but, in their minds, perfectly logical. They would offer to sell Netflix to Blockbuster. In exchange, Netflix would effectively become the digital arm of the empire, handling all online operations and mail delivery, while Blockbuster would continue to completely dominate the physical retail space. It would be a synergistic marriage of brick-and-mortar dominance and digital innovation. The two Netflix founders flew to Dallas. The contrast between the two corporate cultures was immediate, stark, and deeply intimidating. Randolph and Hastings, dressed in standard Silicon Valley casual attire, found themselves stepping into the cavernous, hyper-corporate environment of the Renaissance Tower. They were ushered into a massive heavy-wood boardroom on the 27th floor, a room that practically hummed with the power and wealth of a global monopoly. They were about to pitch the future of entertainment to men who were making billions of dollars off the present. John Antioco, flanked by his general counsel and a phalanx of senior executives, listened politely as Hastings and Randolph delivered their pitch. The startup founders laid out the grand vision of a combined, unstoppable company. Blockbuster.com would become the ultimate destination for home entertainment. A customer could rent a movie online, have it delivered by mail, and if they wanted immediate gratification, simply return it to a physical Blockbuster store and grab a new release off the shelf. It was the flawless blueprint for an omni-channel retail strategy, years ahead of its time. Antioco nodded. He understood the mechanics of the proposal. But then came the crucial, inevitable question. What was the asking price? Reed Hastings took a breath and stated the number: $50 million. For a brief, agonizing moment, the 27th floor boardroom was completely silent. Then the atmosphere shifted. According to Mark Randolph's later recollections of the fateful meeting, it wasn't outright anger or immediate dismissal from the Blockbuster executives. It was something far more insulting. It was amusement. Antioco, a man who oversaw a retail giant generating $6 billion a year, was looking at a tiny startup hemorrhaging cash, asking for $50 million for a website and some postal distribution centers. To put it in perspective, $50 million was roughly the amount Blockbuster collected in late fees every single month. To the Blockbuster executives, the very premise seemed absurd. Why would they pay a premium for a company that was structurally unprofitable? More importantly, Blockbuster's own internal data told them a vastly different story. Their traditional market research suggested that the dot-com boom was overhyped and that the average American consumer would always prefer the instant gratification of driving to a brightly lit store on a Friday night over waiting 2 days for the mailman. Furthermore, adopting Netflix's subscription model meant completely abandoning their most profitable, yet hated, revenue stream. Antayako fundamentally viewed the online rental business as a very small, unprofitable, novelty niche. If Blockbuster ever decided to seriously enter that space, he reasoned, they could simply build it themselves with their own massive resources. They didn't need to buy a drowning Silicon Valley startup to figure out the internet. The Blockbuster CEO essentially laughed them out of the room. He politely but firmly declined the offer, viewing it as a terrible investment of corporate funds. The meeting ended abruptly. Hastings and Randolph walked out of the Renaissance Tower, getting back on a plane to California empty-handed, facing what seemed like inevitable, impending bankruptcy. At that exact moment, on that Tuesday in September 2000, John Antayako had absolutely no idea what he had just done. He believed he had just saved his shareholders $50 million on a worthless, doomed acquisition. In reality, he had just signed Blockbuster's death warrant. He hadn't just passed on an acquisition. He had allowed a deadly parasite to survive. Forced into a corner, the rejection lit a fire of pure desperation under the Netflix team. Desperation breeds ruthless innovation. Without the immense safety net of Blockbuster, Netflix relentlessly refined its distribution algorithms, perfected its flat-rate subscription model, and fundamentally changed American consumer behavior. The $50 million mistake would go down in business history as one of the most catastrophic boardroom errors ever committed. Blockbuster had the ultimate opportunity to buy the future for the price of a rounding error on their balance sheet. Instead, blinded by their own massive success, insulated by their corporate tower, and addicted to an outdated revenue model, they chose to double down on the past. And as the new decade progressed, that past was about to become impossible to defend. In the immediate aftermath of rejecting Netflix, the leadership at Blockbuster felt entirely justified in their decision. Through the early 2000s, their physical stores continued to generate massive amounts of cash, and the brand remained deeply embedded in the American cultural routine. John Antayako and his executive team believed that if a threat to their empire ever truly materialized, it would announce itself clearly, and they would simply crush it with their overwhelming scale. But the fatal blow to Blockbuster did not come as a single frontal assault. Instead, the empire was slowly encircled by a quiet, multi-front war of convenience and pricing. While Netflix was methodically siphoning off the most avid movie watchers, the cinephiles who didn't mind waiting a few days for the mail, a completely different kind of predator was stalking Blockbuster's casual, impulse-driven customers. In 2002, a venture backed by the fast food giant McDonald's began testing a radically stripped-down concept, a fully automated vending machine that dispensed DVD rentals. They painted the machines a vibrant, unmistakable red and called the company Redbox. Redbox fundamentally attacked Blockbuster's core geographic advantage. Blockbuster had spent billions securing prime real estate on busy suburban intersections. Redbox bypassed real estate entirely. They placed their automated kiosks directly inside the vestibules of grocery stores, pharmacies, and convenience stores, places where consumers were already going every single week. More devastatingly, Redbox charged exactly $1 per night. To a family walking out of a supermarket on a Friday evening, the math was violently simple. Why drive an extra 2 miles, walk into a massive Blockbuster, navigate crowded aisles, pay $4 or $5 for a new release, and risk a brutal late fee when they could simply tap a touchscreen on their way out of the grocery store and grab a new movie for a single dollar bill? Redbox possessed practically zero overhead. They had no vast retail spaces to heat or cool, and no armies of teenage clerks to pay. They could afford to survive on razor-thin margins, slowly bleeding Blockbuster's foot traffic dry. Simultaneously, an entirely invisible enemy was breaching the walls of the American living room. The major telecommunications and cable providers, giants like Comcast and Time Warner, were rolling out digital cable boxes equipped with a revolutionary feature: video on demand. For the first time, a consumer could rent a movie without ever leaving their couch. The selection was initially limited, but the absolute friction-free convenience of clicking a button on a remote control and having the rental fee silently added to a monthly cable bill was intoxicating. Suddenly, Blockbuster was surrounded. Netflix was stealing their most profitable, high-volume renters with a massive catalog and no due dates. Redbox was stealing their impulse buyers with rock-bottom prices and ultimate convenience. And the cable companies were entirely eliminating the need for a physical medium. The moat that Wayne Huizenga had dug around the company a decade earlier was evaporating. The blue and yellow stores, once viewed as community cornerstones, were rapidly beginning to feel like massive, expensive, outdated liabilities. As foot traffic began to demonstrably slow and quarterly earnings reports flashed warning signs, CEO John Antioco finally recognized the existential peril facing his company. He understood that Blockbuster's greatest vulnerability was not a lack of inventory, but the deep, simmering resentment their customers harbored over punitive pricing. In late 2004, Antioco made a desperate, highly publicized gamble to win back the loyalty of the American consumer and neutralize the threat of Netflix. Blockbuster launched a massive, multi-million-dollar national marketing campaign, making a stunning announcement: the end of late fees. On television screens across the country, advertisements proudly declared that Blockbuster was turning over a new leaf. If a customer kept a movie a day or two past its due date, they would no longer be penalized. It was an olive branch to a frustrated public. Internally, however, the decision was a financial earthquake. By eliminating late fees, Antioco was voluntarily slicing nearly $500 million of pure profit directly off the company's balance sheet, right at the exact moment when they needed capital the most to build their own digital infrastructure. But the No Late Fees campaign was not just a financial disaster, it became a public relations catastrophe. Because Blockbuster still had to ensure that their limited physical inventory was eventually returned to the shelves, the new policy contained a massive, deeply unpopular catch hidden in the fine print. If a customer kept a movie for more than a week past its due date, the Blockbuster computer system automatically assumed the customer had decided to buy it. The customer's credit card would be instantly charged the full retail purchase price of the DVD, often $25 or $30. If the furious customer then brought the movie back to the store, they would receive a refund, but they would still be hit with a mandatory restocking fee. Consumers felt completely betrayed. They had been promised the end of late fees, only to find themselves slammed with unauthorized purchase charges and restocking penalties. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Customers who had been cautiously willing to give Blockbuster a second chance instead cut up their membership cards in disgust. The outrage reached such a fever pitch that the attorneys general of 47 different states filed lawsuits against Blockbuster for deceptive marketing practices, ultimately forcing the company to pay millions in settlements and change their advertising. Antioco's desperate attempt to save the brand's image had backfired spectacularly. He had successfully cratered the company's most reliable revenue stream, while simultaneously alienating the exact customer base he was trying to save. The physical stores were bleeding cash. The public trust was shattered. But the final nail in the coffin would not be driven by a competitor or a furious customer. It would be driven by the very men sitting inside Blockbuster's own boardroom. As the stock price plummeted and the massive debt from the Viacom days loomed large, a ruthless corporate raider was buying up shares, preparing to launch a civil war that would tear the empire apart from the inside out. While the external threats of Netflix, Redbox, and video on demand were relentlessly chipping away at Blockbuster's market dominance, the most destructive force acting upon the company was entirely internal. To understand the sudden and violent collapse of the empire, one must look beyond the blue and yellow storefronts and examine the crushing financial reality hidden deep within the corporate ledger. The stage for this internal disaster was set in 2004. Viacom, the The massive media conglomerate that had purchased Blockbuster a decade earlier recognized the shifting tides of the entertainment industry. They realized that physical video rental was a mature, potentially declining asset. Viacom decided to spin off Blockbuster into an independent, publicly traded company. However, Viacom did not grant Blockbuster a clean break. As a parting gift, Viacom mandated that the newly independent Blockbuster pay a special one-time dividend of $905 million to Viacom shareholders. Because Blockbuster did not simply have nearly $1 billion in spare liquid cash sitting in a vault. They were forced to take on massive amounts of Wall Street debt to finance this mandatory payout. Overnight, Blockbuster was sent out into a rapidly modernizing, highly competitive retail battlefield with a nearly billion-dollar anchor chained to its ankle. Every single dollar the company generated now had to be heavily diverted just to pay the staggering interest on this newly acquired debt. This meant that precisely at the moment in history when Blockbuster needed immense reserves of capital to build massive server farms, develop streaming technology, and fight a pricing war with Netflix, their coffers were being systematically drained by their former corporate parent. Sensing the blood in the water, a new and formidable predator entered the Blockbuster ecosystem. He was not a rival retail CEO or a Silicon Valley tech visionary. He was Carl Icahn, the legendary billionaire activist investor and corporate raider. Icahn's business philosophy was ruthless and intensely focused on the immediate present. He specialized in buying large stakes in struggling, undervalued companies and using his shareholder voting power to aggressively force the board of directors to make changes that would rapidly boost the stock price. By 2005, Icahn had quietly acquired nearly 10% of Blockbuster's outstanding shares. When he looked at Blockbuster, Icahn did not see a beloved cultural institution trying to navigate a complex digital transition. He saw a spectacularly mismanaged cash cow. He was absolutely furious with CEO John Antioco's decision to drop late fees, viewing the voluntary surrender of $500 million in revenue as corporate malpractice. Furthermore, Icahn was deeply opposed to spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build an online digital infrastructure to fight Netflix. In his view, Blockbuster was fundamentally a physical retail business, and any attempt to pivot to the internet was a wasteful, expensive distraction that was actively destroying shareholder value. The Dallas boardroom transformed into a vicious, high-stakes battleground. On one side stood John Antioco, who had belatedly realized that the company must evolve or die. On the other side stood Carl Icahn, demanding immediate cost-cutting, the restoration of traditional profit margins, and a singular focus on the physical stores. It was a war between long-term survival and short-term stock valuation. And the American consumer was about to become the ultimate casualty. Despite the intense pressure from Carl Icahn and the massive debt payments looming over the company, John Antioco managed to launch one final, desperate counteroffensive against Netflix in late 2006. It was called Blockbuster Total Access, and for a brief, shining moment, it actually looked like it was going to save the empire. Total Access was, from a consumer standpoint, an incredibly brilliant program. It was the first true omnichannel retail strategy in the entertainment space. Customers paid a monthly subscription fee to receive DVDs in the mail, exactly like Netflix. However, Blockbuster utilized its massive remaining structural advantage, its physical real estate. When a customer finished watching a mailed DVD, they didn't have to put it back in the mail and wait days for the next one. They could simply walk into any Blockbuster store, hand the mailed envelope to a cashier, and immediately walk out with a free new release off the shelf. It was the perfect synthesis of digital convenience and physical instant gratification. Netflix simply could not replicate it. In fact, years later, Netflix CEO Reed Hastings would admit that Blockbuster Total Access was the absolute most terrifying threat his company ever faced. It completely neutralized Netflix momentum. In the months following the launch of Total Access, Blockbuster's online subscriber base exploded, rapidly climbing past 3 million users. For the first time in over half a decade, Netflix's subscriber growth flatlined. Blockbuster had finally found a weapon that worked. But this victory came at an excruciating financial cost. To rapidly acquire market share, Antioco had priced total access aggressively low. Every time a customer brought a mailed DVD into a store and walked out with a new release, Blockbuster effectively lost roughly $2 in potential rental revenue and fulfillment costs. The program was designed as a loss leader, a strategic bleed of capital intended to crush Netflix once and for all, with the assumption that once the war was won, Blockbuster could slowly raise prices and achieve profitability. Carl Icahn did not care about winning a war in 2010. He cared about the quarterly earnings report in the spring of 2007. To Icahn, total access was not a brilliant strategic weapon. It was a financial hemorrhage. He watched the company burn through hundreds of millions of dollars to subsidize an online program, while the physical stores continued to struggle under the weight of the Viacom debt. The tension reached its absolute breaking point over a dispute regarding Antioco's executive compensation bonus. Icahn launched a vicious proxy fight, successfully rallying frustrated shareholders against the CEO. He publicly lambasted Antioco's leadership, arguing that the CEO was being lavishly rewarded while the stock price languished and the company bled cash on a foolish internet crusade. The pressure became insurmountable. The board of directors fractured. In early 2007, recognizing that he had lost control of his own boardroom and the support of his largest shareholder, John Antioco negotiated a severance package and resigned. It was a profound corporate tragedy. After years of arrogance and missteps, Blockbuster had finally developed a program that was actively, successfully fighting back against the digital revolution. Total access was working, but the ruthless, short-sighted demands of Wall Street, combined with the crushing weight of their inherited debt, forced the company to stop fighting just as they were beginning to win. With Antioco gone, Carl Icahn and the newly reshaped board needed a leader who shared their vision. They needed a CEO who would stop burning cash on the internet and return Blockbuster to its roots as a physical retailer. They were about to make a pivot so spectacularly ill-timed, it would seal the fate of the company forever. In the summer of 2007, with John Antioco ousted and Carl Icahn heavily influencing the board of directors, Blockbuster needed a new savior. They chose James W. Keyes. Keyes was a highly respected, traditional retail executive who had previously orchestrated a massive and successful turnaround of the 7-Eleven convenience store chain. He understood foot traffic, end cap displays, inventory management, and store layouts better than almost anyone in the industry. But he was fundamentally a brick-and-mortar tactician stepping into the middle of a vicious digital revolution. When Keyes took the helm as CEO, he surveyed the battlefield and arrived at a conclusion that perfectly aligned with Carl Icahn's demands, but completely contradicted the reality of consumer behavior. Keyes looked at Blockbuster Total Access, the omni-channel program that was successfully stalling Netflix's growth, and saw only a massive, unacceptable financial drain. Because Total Access allowed customers to exchange mailed DVDs for free in-store rentals, the program was severely eating into the company's retail margins. Keyes firmly believed that Blockbuster's destiny did not lie in the mailroom, and it certainly did not lie on the internet. He viewed the physical store not as an outdated liability, but as the company's ultimate, unassailable asset. He envisioned transforming the thousands of Blockbuster locations from simple rental counters into entertainment destinations. He wanted to sell more snacks, introduce consumer electronics, and make the physical act of browsing aisles a premium experience. To execute this vision, the new CEO immediately took an axe to the digital budget. He drastically slashed the aggressive marketing campaigns for Total Access and significantly raised the prices for the online subscription. He intentionally dismantled the very weapon that had brought Netflix to a standstill. The results were mathematically predictable and strategically catastrophic. By raising prices and cutting promotion, Blockbuster abandoned its digital momentum entirely. In the quarters that followed, Total Access rapidly hemorrhaged hundreds of thousands of subscribers. Freed from the intense pressure of a heavily subsidized competitor, Netflix CEO Reed Hastings breathed a massive sigh of relief and aggressively reclaimed the digital market. Blockbuster had voluntarily surrendered the future to focus entirely on the past. But the tragedy of Jim Keyes' tenure was not just that he ignored the internet. It was what he attempted to do with the physical stores next. As the core DVD rental business continued its slow, irreversible decline, Keyes began looking for a radical way to maximize the massive retail footprint he now controlled. His proposed solution would go down as one of the most baffling and desperate corporate maneuvers of the decade. In April of 2008, the retail world was stunned when Blockbuster officially launched a hostile, $1 billion takeover bid for Circuit City. At the time, Circuit City was the second largest electronics retailer in the United States, but it was a company in absolute freefall, desperately losing ground to Best Buy and bleeding cash at an alarming rate. Keyes' underlying logic for the acquisition was rooted in extreme retail synergy. He hypothesized that if Blockbuster could merge with Circuit City, they could create a colossal, one-stop entertainment megastore. Customers could walk in to buy a high-definition flat-screen television and simultaneously rent the Blu-ray disc to watch on it. Wall Street analysts and industry experts were absolutely paralyzed by the absurdity of the proposal. It was widely described not as a strategic merger, but as two drowning men grabbing onto each other in the middle of a hurricane. Blockbuster, a company suffocating under nearly $1 billion of Viacom-era debt, was attempting to borrow even more money to buy another failing retailer that was also loaded with toxic debt. For 3 agonizing months, Blockbuster pursued the doomed acquisition, expending massive amounts of executive energy, legal fees, and public relations capital. Finally, in July of 2008, after looking closer at Circuit City's catastrophic internal financials, Blockbuster abruptly withdrew the bid. Circuit City would go completely bankrupt just a few months later. Blockbuster had narrowly avoided dragging a billion-dollar corpse onto its own sinking ship, but the distraction proved fatal. While the executive team had been hyper-focused on the Circuit City delusion, they had completely lost whatever remaining grip they had on the actual entertainment market. Netflix had quietly launched its first true streaming video service. Redbox kiosks were multiplying like a virus in every grocery store in America. And then, the ultimate macroeconomic hammer fell. In September 2008, the global financial system collapsed. The Great Recession swept across the United States, instantly freezing credit markets and devastating consumer spending. Families who were losing their homes and their jobs completely eliminated casual, impulse entertainment trips from their budgets. Foot traffic in suburban strip malls evaporated. For Blockbuster, the timing was an absolute death sentence. They were trapped in thousands of expensive, long-term commercial real estate leases. Their core product was rapidly becoming obsolete. They had intentionally alienated their digital subscriber base, and the massive mountain of debt they had carried for years suddenly became impossible to refinance in a frozen credit market. The fatal pivot back to physical retail had driven the empire directly into a brick wall at the exact moment the global economy imploded. There were no more strategies left to pivot toward, no more rivals to buy, and no more billion-dollar dividends to squeeze from the American public. The lights in the Renaissance Tower were still on, but the corporate machine was already dead. The only thing left to do was watch the blue and yellow empire slowly tear itself down, store by store. By 2010, the blue and yellow giant was effectively on life support. The catastrophic combination of the 2008 financial crisis, the massive, unyielding burden of debt inherited from the Viacom era, and the unstoppable momentum of digital streaming had finally pushed Blockbuster past the point of no return. On Wall Street, the company that had once commanded a multi-billion-dollar valuation and dictated terms to Hollywood studios was unceremoniously delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. Its shares, once a cornerstone of retail investment portfolios, plummeted to mere pennies, trading over the counter as a worthless zombie stock. Inside the physical stores, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The vibrant, bustling weekend destinations of the late 90s had slowly transformed into something resembling a prolonged, depressing waiting room. To desperately conserve cash, corporate leadership had severely restricted the purchasing of new movie titles. The new releases wall, once the absolute crown jewel of the Blockbuster experience, featuring dozens of guaranteed copies of the latest box office hit, grew sparse and entirely unpredictable. Customers who still possessed the loyalty, or the lack of high-speed broadband internet, to walk through the doors were increasingly met with older catalog titles and an unmistakable, lingering air of corporate decay. The high-energy, fluorescent-lit Friday nights, the chaotic joy of children running toward the video game section, felt like a distant, fading memory. The iconic blue and yellow carpets looked noticeably worn. The massive store spaces felt hollow and excessively quiet. The inevitable finally occurred on September 23, 2010. Under the crushing weight of nearly $1 billion in outstanding debt, Blockbuster officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in New York. Initially, the remaining executive leadership attempted to spin the filing not as a death sentence, but as a strategic, necessary reorganization. The stated corporate plan was relentlessly optimistic. They would use the bankruptcy courts to legally shed their most unprofitable, long-term commercial store leases, restructure the suffocating debt agreements with their creditors, and emerge as a leaner, highly competitive digital and physical hybrid company. But the fundamental flaw in this logic was glaringly obvious to everyone outside the boardroom. A leaner physical video store was still, fundamentally, a physical video store. They were trying to optimize a horse-drawn carriage in the middle of the automotive revolution. Consumers were rapidly purchasing Roku boxes, connecting their video game consoles to the internet, and learning to stream high-definition movies directly to their flat-screen televisions. The friction of driving to a store had been entirely eliminated by their competitors. As the bankruptcy proceedings dragged on through the winter of 2010 and into 2011, it became painfully apparent that Blockbuster could not restructure its way out of total obsolescence. They were bleeding tens of millions of dollars a month just to keep the lights on in their remaining fleet of locations. The major Hollywood studios, sensing the absolute end, began demanding strict upfront cash payments for DVDs, further strangling the company's already fragile supply chain. The creditors, realizing that the underlying business model was entirely dead and that the company was worth more dead than alive, demanded a full liquidation of the assets. The once mighty empire, which had vanquished thousands of independent, mom-and-pop video stores and dominated the globe, was officially put up for auction to the highest bidder. In April 2011, a bizarre glimmer of false hope appeared on the horizon. The satellite television provider Dish Network won the bankruptcy auction, purchasing the entirety of Blockbuster for a mere $320 million. To put that number into perspective, it was a staggering 96% drop from the $8.4 billion Viacom had paid for the company just 17 years earlier. Dish Network's CEO, Charlie Ergen, initially presented a vision of retail salvation. He claimed he wanted to keep a large portion of the stores open, utilizing the vast retail footprint to cross-sell Dish satellite subscriptions, mobile phones, and internet packages alongside traditional DVD rentals. He also wanted to leverage the immense, lingering brand recognition of Blockbuster to launch a proprietary streaming service to directly rival Netflix. But this grand cross-promotional retail experiment was agonizingly short-lived. The physical rental market was not just shrinking, it was in absolute freefall. Customers did not want to buy a 2-year satellite television contract while returning a late DVD. Over the next 2 years, Dish Network executives looked at the rapidly deteriorating balance sheets and quietly, systematically began to dismantle the physical empire. They closed hundreds of locations in massive rolling waves, turning the former retail behemoth into a rapidly vanishing ghost ship. Then came the final, definitive blow. In November 2013, Dish Network officially announced that it would be shuttering all remaining corporate-owned Blockbuster stores in the United States by early 2014. The announcement triggered a nationwide wave of liquidation sales that felt less like a standard business transaction and more like a massive collective garage sale of American pop culture. Massive, violently yellow banners reading, "Store closing, everything must go," were draped across the iconic blue awnings in thousands of strip malls. Everything inside the stores was suddenly slapped with a bright orange clearance sticker. The liquidation went far beyond the sale of previously viewed DVDs. The corporate infrastructure itself was being sold for scrap. Customers flocked to the dying stores one last time, driven by a powerful mix of nostalgia and bargain hunting. They didn't just buy movies. They bought the heavy wire display racks. They bought the industrial shelving units. They purchased the faded gumball machines that had sat by the front doors for decades. Some even bought the framed movie posters, the torn ticket window decals, and the blue and yellow polo shirts straight off the backs of their remaining employees. In a moment of profound cinematic irony, the very last movie ever rented from a corporate-owned blockbuster was at a store in Hawaii in November 2013. The title of the film was This Is the End. The final days in January 2014 were deeply melancholic, marking the quiet, unceremonious death of a cultural institution. For the tens of thousands of store managers, shift supervisors, and teenage clerks who had manned the checkout counters, it was the bitter end of an era. They spent their final shifts entirely dismantling the spaces they had spent years meticulously organizing. There were no grand farewells from corporate, only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the stark reality of sudden unemployment. As the final day of operation concluded, a solemn, synchronized ritual took place across the country. Employees swept the now bare industrial carpets one last time. They unplugged the glowing neon signage that had served as a beacon for weekend entertainment. They walked out, turned the keys in the glass doors, and walked away from the empty, cavernous retail spaces. The empire had officially fallen. Over the next few years, those thousands of highly recognizable, standalone suburban buildings would be slowly hollowed out and repurposed, quietly transforming into urgent care clinics, auto parts stores, laundromats, and veterinary offices, erasing the physical footprint of the blockbuster generation from the American landscape. By the time Dish Network officially pulled the plug on the corporate infrastructure in early 2014, the Blockbuster brand was widely considered a corporate corpse. The massive empire had been meticulously dismantled, the prime real estate repurposed, and the iconic torn ticket logo relegated to the dustbin of retail history. Or so it seemed. Hidden away in the high desert of Central Oregon, a bizarre and beautiful anomaly stubbornly refused to die. During the aggressive expansion era of the late 80s and early 90s, the company had allowed a small percentage of stores to be operated by independent franchisees. One of those franchise locations sat in a modest, unassuming strip mall in Bend, Oregon. Because it was locally owned by Ken and Debbie Tischer and managed by a fiercely dedicated woman named Sandy Harding, it was not legally subject to the mandatory corporate liquidation. They owned their own inventory. They paid their own rent. As long as they continued to pay a licensing fee to Dish Network to use the trademark, and as long as they could figure out how to independently source new DVDs without the backing of a corporate supply chain, they were allowed to keep the lights on. Through the mid-2010s, as the rest of the world fully transitioned to broadband streaming and cloud-based entertainment, the Bend store quietly continued its daily operations, serving a loyal local community that still appreciated the physical format. But as the number of surviving franchise locations globally dwindled from a few dozen to a handful to just one, something entirely extraordinary happened. In March 2019, an outlet in Perth, Australia, finally closed its doors, officially making the Bend, Oregon location the very last operating Blockbuster Video on planet Earth. Almost overnight, this ordinary suburban video store transformed into an international tourist destination. It became a mecca for Millennial and Generation X nostalgia. Families began traveling from across the United States and even across oceans, not necessarily to rent a movie, but to step inside a living, breathing time capsule. They came to take photographs beneath the glowing yellow awning, to hear the distinct, forgotten clack of a plastic DVD case being snapped shut at the register, and to inhale the highly specific, deeply familiar scent of industrial carpet cleaner and plastic media. The store adapted to its new reality, surviving not just on rentals, but by selling massive amounts of custom merchandise, t-shirts, trucker hats, and bumper stickers, proudly declaring its status as the lone survivor. The enduring existence of the Bend store highlights a profound, almost comical cultural irony. In the late 90s, Blockbuster was widely despised by the American public. It was the ruthless corporate Goliath that had mercilessly destroyed beloved independent mom-and-pop video stores, homogenized the movie industry, and relentlessly punished working families with exorbitant, predatory late fees. Yet 2 decades later, the public had completely forgiven them. In a modern era dominated by the cold, algorithmic perfection of streaming platforms and the paralyzing fatigue of choice, that comes with endless, infinite digital scrolling, people suddenly miss the friction of the physical world. The last blockbuster stands today as a living monument to a vanished cultural ritual. It reminds us of a time when watching a movie required deliberate intention. You had to leave your house, coordinate with your family, roam the brightly lit aisles, physically negotiate over a single title, and commit to an object for the evening. The Ben location survives not because it offers the most efficient way to consume media, but because it is the only place left on Earth that sells the authentic, tactile memory of the American Friday night. Blockbuster's demise is often reduced to a single, convenient punchline: the $50 million missed opportunity to buy Netflix. But the truth of this corporate tragedy is far more complex and far more cautionary. Retail empires rarely collapse from a single misstep or a sudden stroke of bad luck. They fall because they become so deeply insulated by their own massive success that they confuse their current market dominance with permanent invincibility. Blockbuster built a global fortress out of brick, mortar, and late fees, fundamentally believing that they owned the American consumer's time. They failed to realize that they were merely renting our attention. The moment a more convenient, less punitive option arrived, the empire's moat dried up instantly. It is a harsh reminder that a business lives by relentless adaptation, but dies the moment it believes the past will protect its future. Yet despite the billions of dollars lost, the brutal boardroom civil wars, and the predatory pricing model that defined its final years, the blue and yellow torn ticket remains deeply embedded in the American psyche. We don't mourn the corporate entity, and we certainly don't miss paying a $30 penalty for forgetting a DVD in the backseat of a minivan. What we actually miss is the ritual. We miss the physical friction of the weekend. In our current era of infinite digital scrolling, where cold algorithms silently dictate our entertainment choices, there is a profound, lingering nostalgia for the tangible joy of roaming brightly lit aisles. We miss the shared physical experience of an entire family arguing over what to watch on a Friday night. The thousands of massive storefronts have long been absorbed by a changing landscape, hollowed out and transformed into urgent care clinics, auto parts stores, and laundromats. The physical footprint has been erased, but the memory of what happened inside those walls, the simple magic of the blockbuster night, can never quite be overwritten. What was your most memorable blockbuster experience? Did you have a favorite section to browse or a legendary story about a ridiculous late fee? Share your weekend memories in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into retail history insightful, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and join us next time as we continue